Yeah, I'm Cathal Poirteir. I've researched the folklore of the famine, both in Irish and English, and have published two books, a compendia of famine memories and social history. Yes, I'm working in the footsteps of John O'Connor from Strokestown, from the Mahon estate. I got the assisted passage to Canada, survived the long walk to Dublin along the canal. We went to Liverpool, where some people caught fever. Fortunately, neither I, my wife, or the two children who travelled with us did. We made it to Canada. We made it through Gross Eel, and I began working there. And the idea was that I would work and send money back to some of our children who were still in Ireland to allow them to pay the passage to come and join us later. Unfortunately, I was murdered, and another Strokestown native was charged with my murder, but before he was, my wife's body was found as well. He was hanged for the two murders, and he willingly admitted that he had murdered my wife, and right until he went to the gallows he denied that he had murdered me, and said that my wife had done that, and that they had stolen the money that I had saved to bring our children across, and that money was found on him when he was arrested. Yeah, I suppose the biggest thing was the huge language shift. At the time of the famine, there would have been about 4 million people who could speak Irish. A good proportion of them could speak English as well, but you would certainly have been talking about maybe 1.5 million people who were monoglot Irish speakers. Between death and emigration, and again you have to remember that the west of Ireland was worse affected by the famine, by death and by emigration than the east of the country, so that means that the Irish speaking areas were probably more traumatically affected by the famine. And it meant two things. One, you had the loss of Irish speakers through death and emigration, but also you had a lot of the culture that had been contained within the Irish language. If we take songs and folk tales as examples, songs really didn't transfer from one language to the other because they involved metre and poetry and such like. You would have had some macaronic songs in both languages that would have survived, but there was a big loss of the song tradition, which had been a continuous line for hundreds of years before that, and a loss of poetry, because a lot of the poetry was passed on orally. Even after the famine, some people could recite long poems that have been composed maybe 100, 200 years before that. But for a large part, we don't know what was lost because we just know that so much was lost. And then from the point of view of folk tales, even though Ireland would be very famous for folk tales, in Western Europe, the collection that we have of folk tales collected in English and Irish would be the largest collection in Western Europe. But most of that was collected in Irish language, because a lot of the folk tales, because they're long and complicated and involved, they just didn't seem to make that transition from Irish to English. So when shorter things like legends were transmittable from Irish to English, it just didn't seem to happen with the folk tales. So again, there was a huge loss, and it was because of that say, for example, in 1893, when the Gaelic League was founded, that was a realisation that the famine had devastated the Irish language in Ireland, and that there was a huge loss of cultural capital. And then began the long, slow task of trying to retrieve and preserve as much of that culture as possible, which would have led eventually to the founding of the Irish Folklore Commission in 1935, and they set about the work of going around the country collecting all sorts of folklore. In the Irish-speaking areas, and from Irish-speaking people, they collected the material in Irish. In English-speaking areas, they collected material in English. That would have involved folk tales, legends, songs, but also folk belief and calendar customs and historical lore. So if we take, for example, the Great Irish Famine, The Irish Folklore Commission issued a questionnaire in 1937, 38, I think, 1945, to people all around the country, mostly school teachers who'd been involved in a school's folklore collection scheme in 1937, 38. And those responses were collated and are kept in the National Folklore Archive in UCD. Well, I think we can learn what we choose from it to a large extent. We can look at how devastating an ecological disaster can be if it's allowed to happen, or if it does happen. We could look at how necessary it is for a political system to care about the people under its care or under its control, that we shouldn't allow economic or political orthodoxies to decide how we react to human disaster. It should make us more conscious of how immigrants and emigrants are treated. It should make us more conscious of our debt of gratitude to people from other countries who never saw Ireland, but were still willing to contribute when they heard of the ecological and the famine disaster here, because all around the world somewhere there's always a famine going on and there's always people in need of help.